We all belong to a dominant culture, and we also all belong to probably many different co-cultures. And the book kind of only talks about the dominant culture and the co-culture. I also want to introduce the idea of subculture and try to differentiate between the three. So when you belong to a dominant culture, what we're talking about there is, usually the country or the region in which you live, the groups to which you belong, and those groups, those regions, that country, those things are fairly much the norm. They're not really looked at in any way as being separate than, different than. It's sort of it really is the dominant group of people within that area. So it could be connected to race, gender or sex, sexual orientation, heritage in general. And so you can go into certain parts of the country or the world. And so we'll use, for instance, like East Los Angeles. East LA is the dominant culture there is Hispanic. Many, many, many people from all over Latin America, from Mexico. So it is primarily Spanish speaking and people who come from Latin America and Central America. And so this is the dominant culture in this one little part of greater Los Angeles. If you are a Caucasian English-speaking person in East LA, you're actually not a member of that dominant culture right then and there. So the dominant culture is really just the most prevalent culture in any given space. And people who belong to a co-culture are within that dominant culture, but they also belong to smaller groups. And those groups don't really necessarily conform to the norms of the dominant culture. But I also like to introduce subculture here because I think the book neglects to talk about how subculture is really, it's the idea of sub, being subterranean, sort of under the radar or under the visible components of the dominant culture. Whereas co-cultures really are kind of moving alongside and not necessarily looked at as being strange or different. So for instance, in the dominant culture of American society, let's say we are in New York City and we're all walking around in New York City. The dominant culture here is, we're all New Yorkers, or we're all in that city. There is no one race, gender, sexual orientation. It's a whole mishmash of different people. Traditionally, the norms of American society and what people might perceive as being the dominant culture would fairly, I would say it's not a stretch to say it's this heteronormative society. So heterosexual, not necessarily Caucasian, although traditionally we would refer to somebody who's African American, who's Hispanic, who's Asian, to be minority. It really depends on where we are. English speaking, etc. But you can be walking around Manhattan as a person who is Hispanic, who is transgender, who is English speaking or Spanish speaking, wearing a Yankees hat, for instance. And all of these little components are co-cultural. So it means that you're still a part of that dominant culture, but then you also belong to all these little side cultures, these other groups related to the music that you love, the sports that you follow, and the ways in which you identify, whether those are race or ethnicity, your interests, your sexual orientation, your gender identity, etc. And then subcultural is really, again, sort of below the radar and oftentimes seen as being less than or so radically different than the dominant culture that it's not widely discussed. So in this instance, it may be something like people who use certain drugs, people who participate in certain sexual fetishes, for instance. These are not widely discussed. It is not readily available through multimedia or mainstream media channels. It's just, we know that it exists, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we know people who are part of these cultures. I would argue you might know people who are part of some subcultures, but you don't necessarily know that they're a part of a subculture, whereas you probably know if they're a part of a co-culture. Now, the book also talks about language and competent communication when you are a member of a co-culture or a subculture within the dominant culture, and some of the ways that those people might communicate in an effort to appear more competent. I think that there's a lot of validity to this. For instance, the use of various forms of language which are more polite, trying to counteract any sort of negative stereotype that might go along with that co-culture or subculture. Um, and then also trying to conform by using image management and being very self-aware in an effort to blend in to the dominant culture. There is some validity to all of that, but I would also argue that this is more of this is in line with the expectations that took place at the turn of the 20th century. So many immigrants coming into America, many of them through Ellis Island, from all over the world, but primarily from European countries. And as a co-culture, if I'm coming over from Ireland, from Italy, from Poland, as an immigrant, as a person who belongs to that co-culture, to be perceived as more competent, I may change some of my communication to try to fit in. And this notion of, they call it assimilation. It was like this idea of the blended society, the melting pot, if you will, is really where I think the suggestions here come out of. It's this old school way of looking at culture and wanting to be perceived as part of the more dominant culture. But I do think that we're a changed world, and I think in a globalized world, there's less of a push for this sort of thing. And I do think that we can be part of many co-cultures that are within the dominant culture and not need to change who we are in order to fit in. I think there is a lot more acceptance around that. Subculture, I do think that we still, there's a reason that people choose to keep their subcultural identification secret in many cases, and that is because, again, it is not perceived as being alongside or really in along with the dominant culture as being something that's widely accepted. So hopefully that explained the difference between these various types of cultures in a way that allows you to see where you might fit in to either a subculture, a co-culture, and the dominant culture.